I'm going to go back to talking about the visual aesthetics that I've mentioned in previous videos, the six basic visual components as taught by Bruce Block in his visual story book. And I want to talk about rhythm. And rhythm, there are two different aspects to it. One is the visual rhythm within a single frame, which is essentially how the objects are arranged and if there's any kind of symmetry to it, or lack of symmetry that can create visual rhythm in terms of kind of like what your eye is stopping on as it looks at a frame. But most of the time, the way it's kind of most effective, or some of what I think is the more interesting way to think about rhythm, is to talk about it in terms of the edit, the visual edit. And I thought we could do that by looking at the famous shower scene from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which has been talked about a lot. Many people watch it in film schools. It's a historically watched and talked about movie. Um, but at least from what I've seen, there are certain things that people haven't talked about, which I find really interesting to consider about this particular scene in the movie. It is, there's a documentary about it, which talks about how this scene was actually the most important scene to Alfred Hitchcock as he planned the production. They took a week to shoot it. It's less than 3 minutes long. So think about that. Like a whole week to shoot something less than 3 minutes is quite a production. It has uh, about 54 cuts in it, edits. So we're going to look at the actual edit and talk about the kind of visual rhythm of that edit. And it has almost 80 camera angles or camera setups in it. A couple of them have movement in it. So it's really quite a production. And so again, it's interesting to talk about it from an editing standpoint because you'll see kind of how things come together, which again I think can help and it's something as a tool, especially when you're editing your project, that can help you figure out how to pace your film, things that you can do to make things more exciting or to kind of pull back if it's just like a little too intense, things like that. The visual rhythm is something that you can really think about. Now, a lot of people consider editing an invisible art, right? You're not really supposed to notice the edit. And in fact, the principles of coverage and preserving the 180 degree line and how we rotate camera more than, the 20 millimeter 30-degree rule, where we'll kind of rotate camera at least 30 degrees and change lenses at least 20 millimeters in the focal length. Those are ways, that protocol that has been designed to make a seamless edit, to avoid this kind of jump cut effect where we're like, it just feels a little bit awkward. Now, of course, the jump cut has been used and developed over the decades of filmmaking, but traditionally, the approach has always been to have editing be this kind of seamless, invisible, where we just, it's crazy to think about how we don't really think about or notice or feel something odd when we go from a two shot to an over the shoulder. It feels very seamless. And then we cut to a close up. It all feels very seamless. And when in fact we're literally jumping around and getting closer to objects and farther away. And so I find editing really fascinating in that sense. And so it's designed to be invisible, but it really does have a rhythm to it. And that's something to pay attention to in your edit. And so in the same way that a song has a beat, and a rhythm to whatever the melody is, your edits are kind of like a beat. And so if there's a very steady beat to your cuts, that can give, the a certain pacing. If it starts to speed up, it's like a song speeding up in its beat or rhythm, and it starts to get a little bit more intense and more exciting. And if it starts to slow down, it gets a little more relaxed and a little more easy. So this is the same in a visual edit. And we feel the edit subconsciously, even if we don't necessarily know it. Okay, so I'm not gonna play the whole shower sequence here. I'm gonna put the link in the body of the post so you can go and look at it, but we will be kind of scrubbing through so you'll kind of see the sequences. And so you'll see in these markers that I've placed in my Adobe Premiere, you can see where each of the edits happen. So if I just drag it across, you'll see we start out with her going into the bathroom. She steps into the bathtub, pulls the shower curtain. Now we're in the shower with her. She turns on the water. She starts washing herself. She, it's kind of turning around. We're looking at, the shots of the water. And then all of a sudden here, we go from the shot of the shower head, and now we are on the other side of the 180-degree line. So if we go back and look, all the times before these shots, the camera is on the outside of the tub, kind of looking in, facing the bathroom wall. And the water is coming from left to right in this direction. And this is a jump cut here. Like, we've gotten a little bit closer, but we haven't really rotated much. And we'll talk about kind of why. We cut to the shower head here, which is not on the line, but to a certain extent, it's like a cutaway or a neutral shot, which then makes it a little bit more acceptable to go on the other side of the 180-degree line, where the camera is now where the wall was. And we are facing the shower curtain instead of facing the wall. And the water, as you can see, is now coming from right to left. So we've kind of changed this directionality. And so one question that I always ask is, well, why? Why do we swap to the other side? Why do we make this huge jump to the other side of the 180-degree line? Because it is going to create this, it is considered a continuity error in the invisible art of editing. So these are, the questions. What would motivate this from a directing standpoint? Well, as we cut to this wider shot, again, a bit of a jump cut there, we now see, the shot is emphasizing the rest of the shower curtain, which is obscuring our view of the bathroom. But pretty soon we will see that the door opens and a figure comes in. The camera pushes in past Janet Leigh, and boom, we've got the killer with a knife, holding a knife. And so, again, this is a great motivator to why the director would want to place us in the shower with Janet Leigh, because now we are effectively identifying with and placed in the same position as this naked, vulnerable woman who is showering. And at the same time, we are given the knowledge that the character is unaware of, that somebody has now entered the bathroom. And that is a frightening thing. So it creates a sense of suspense. So horror films and thriller films, they rely on scares in two different ways. One is when you are placed in the character's footsteps and you are scared as they are scared, and those are often considered jump scares. Whereas this is a case where uh, you know more than the character, and that creates a suspense because we're worried about her. She's naked in a shower. It's a very vulnerable position to be in, and we are rightly worried because there is this crazy person who's silhouetted, so we can't see them properly. They're obscured, which again is very frightening. We don't know who this person is, and they have a knife. It is very clear that they are having a knife. And then chaos ensues, and you can see here down all these markers here that there are a series of edits that happen as the shower scene goes on. And we'll take a look at some of the data of this. And then the killer runs away, and we now have kind of a longer space in between the edits where, I guess there's a possibility where she could survive, but she's clearly suffering, slumping down. Here again, another long take before we cut to her pulling the shower curtain down. And then she flops over. We get this kind of ominous shot of the shower head, blood running down into the drain. I put a cut here. It's technically a dissolve to the eye, which is kind of rotating here. This is actually an optical effect. This is a frozen still image that is rotating, that they've created as an optical, and then it hooks up with the live footage. Here you can see that kind of shake right there as the camera and the movement of the film picks back up. We then pull back from her frozen, clearly dead body. And this has also been famously talked about, where this was supposed to be a continuous pullback shot, but Alfred Hitchcock's wife noticed that Janet Leigh took a breath right here. So we cut to the shower head and then cut back to her, and we move off to look at the house, and other things ensue. So that's the sequence here. And again, you can see with the markers here that there is a very kind of chaotic, not very steady rhythm of the edit, where we start with these kind of slower edits. There's a quick edit here, but it's almost they're just kind of moving us along. But I do think that there are more edits than necessary in this opening sequence, and I would venture to say that that is to help anticipate the fact that it's going to go off the rails very quickly. So again, we don't necessarily need some of these jump cuts that we have, but this establishes that where the orientation of where we are, the line, the way the camera is moving across the line, and then all hell breaks loose, right? And now we've got all these cuts, and if you look at the data and the timeline, these cuts are actually happening in less than a second. Sometimes there are only like 7 frames in between cuts out of 24 frames that this is being shot in. So that's, it's a fraction of a second that these cuts are happening, that Hitchcock is editing together this very, very intense thing. So again, the rhythm of the edit becomes very, very fast in the same way that a song's beat ramps up to this crazy kind of boom, 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 boom. And that is very intense for the audience. And then once the killer runs away, things slow down. And again, it's still tense, but you don't need or want to have all these edits because you kind of want to see what's going to happen with her, you know? And we're really kind of slowing down to focus and pay attention to what's going on here and to really feel this tragic and horrible moment, and all of that stuff. So if you look at this on a timeline graph, and I kind of arbitrarily assigned them intensity numbers just so that we could see this visually. But, essentially, when we start out here at the beginning, we're kind of in a normal, this is our normal. So this is very kind of like baseline. And then we're in the shower. So there's a little bit of a jump because it's like, oh, we're actually going to be in the shower with her. That's a little scandalous, you know? So I put a little bit of a bump here. But then it's kind of like, okay, she's showering, blah, blah, blah. And then we flip the 180-degree line. And so that's kind of a bump there because it's like, oh, okay, now we've changed our orientation. That's that, why? That's kind of curious. So I bumped up the intensity level here. And then clearly, when we get to this shot and we see this character, this silhouetted character coming in, it's like, okay, well, now I'm really, really scared. So the intensity jumps quite a bit here. And then we've got all these shots. We do these a quick succession of shots where we go super, super close. So the intensity is just ramping up. Now we're low angle looking up at this person. Now we're kind of up higher at the level of the murderer coming down with the knife. We're flat on. We're changing our angles. So there's just, again, a lot of intensity. We've got this very quick insert that's kind of disorienting of elbows moving as they're struggling. Now we're basically overhead bird's eye view as the killer is bringing the knife down. We go back to her face screaming. Now we've got this kind of blurry out of focus shot of the knife, and the struggle again where she's trying to stop, uh, you know, try and stop getting stabbed, back to her face, and again, flat on with the killer. She's dodging out of the way, closer on the killer, closer on her. She's barely even like framed properly. It's again this very visceral shooting style, or composition of the shots. And then we've got this really cool extreme close up of the hand and the knife coming through the water spray. We get this a couple of times right here coming through. And then the famous kind of stabbing of her stomach, which, Hitchcock did all those cool, like the sound tests for. Um, and now we're low again as the knife comes down. So again, we're just all over the place. Blood is pouring down. She turns away. The knife keeps coming. More blood. Blurry hands trying to block. And then again, the murderer runs away, and we get this, again, these slower shots where we're just kind of with her. We're not going to keep changing 180-degree lines, which again we see throughout here because sometimes we're facing the killer and sometimes we're facing her. So essentially we are switching back and forth across the 180-degree line. And what that's doing is is really interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. But again, you've got this kind of scatter plot that I've created, um, based on the time of the shots and this kind of arbitrary bumping up of the the content and the intensity and the suspense that's building over the course of the sequence. And when you look at the scatter plot, hopefully it's pretty clear that it takes the same shape as a narrative arc, right? So a narrative arc kind of starts out with our kind of exposition, our normal, our introduction to this world, and then something happens which turns things like, oh my God, this person has entered the bathroom, and then things start ramping up. And there's this central question of, is she going to survive this experience or not? And it reaches that climax, which answers that question, that it's not looking good for her. And then it kind of slows down in the resolution, and the intensity falls as we kind of come to terms with the fact that she is dying, right? So it's really fascinating to watch this. Essentially, any scene or every scene in your project should have a narrative arc, intensity rise and fall in the scene itself. And then those little narrative arcs in each scene then add up to and contribute to the overall narrative arc of your larger piece, whatever that scene belongs to. So, it's interesting to take a look at it from that perspective. And the visual edit in this case helps with the intensity. Now, there are a couple of other things that the visual edit here and the rhythm helps with ramping up that intensity. And that has to do with some of the other visual aesthetic aspects, the basic visual components that Bruce Block talks about. First off, this is a black and white movie, so we have no color, and we can really, but we can talk about tone, which again is that grayscale. So one of the things that's really interesting about the shower scene is that as a horror film, it is a very brightly lit scene. There are no shadows, there's no hidden monster that kind of comes out, except for obviously the monster is silhouetted, right? So he is or she is hidden. Spoiler alert. And so so there is this contrast between this very bright white bathroom, and she's a very light skinned, white woman, and then we have this very dark silhouetted killer, right? And the knife itself is black. I mean, everything is just very dark about this character. So that's one thing that helps build up this intensity, is this very direct visual contrast between the very bright white room and the very dark black, uh, silhouetted character. But what I think the and obviously editing back and forth between those images creates this very stark contrast between the light and the dark. But what I think is even more interesting is that, going back to what I said earlier about the water direction, so we start out at first, the water is moving from left to right in our normal. And then when we flip the 180-degree line, the water is now moving from right to left. And so as we flip the 180-degree line, depending on whether we're looking at the killer versus looking at the wall, the water will keep flipping direction. So I want you to take a look at right here. There is the water, which is kind of out of focus. It is moving from right to left, which is a diagonal across the frame that is perpendicular to the line or the diagonal that the knife is making and kind of pointing towards, right? And then it kind of comes down, and then we cross the 180-degree line. The water is now moving along that same line that the knife was moving in from left to right of frame. And then we flip again. This one with the low angle, it's a little bit more kind of vertical. But essentially, again, the water is running from right to left. The knife is moving from left to right. And then it flips again, where the water is now moving from left to right and the knife is moving from right to left. And the reason why this is really cool or kind of crazy is that as this scene progresses and we keep flipping back and forth, what happens is that the water and the knife keep moving in this direction, creating this diagonal X across the frame, which is basically emphasizing this slicing motion and only enhancing the kind of stabbing, the visceral feeling of being cut, right? So the visuals on the frame are adding to the content of what is actually happening in the story. And so I just love how, you get these moments where it's just so very clear the water is moving here and the knife is coming here, and then we've got these close-ups where the knife is hitting through the water and it's just hitting right at that junction point, and it's a very visceral visual assault in terms of how it's choreographed and composed in the frame. And you wouldn't get that same feeling if you stayed on just one side of the 180-degree line, because you wouldn't be getting the flipping back and forth of the water and the knife and the disorientation that continuity error of crossing the 180-degree line creates, because you just kind of don't know, are you up, are you down? And to a certain extent, the brightness of the bathroom helps create this very ambiguous space, even though typically we would associate that with darkness and shadows where you don't quite know where the walls are, where the ceiling is, or things like that. But in this case, the brightness of the bathroom actually creates the same effect, where it's kind of endless and you don't really know where anything is. So we've got tone working for us, the light and the dark. We've got lines and movement of objects, creating those lines and creating and emphasizing the slicing motion across the frame as the character, is getting sliced. And then, that is emphasized by these rapid cuts between and, cutting across the 180-degree line. And then we also have, at the end, this, the blood is going towards the drain, and this drain then dissolves into her eye. And so literally, her life is going down the drain, and that is, confirmed by her body that's there. And this, there's a symbolism here with the circular drain and the circular eye that's kind of emphasized here, which is obviously a very different kind of shape than that triangular knife and the very angular and linear diagonal lines that are created, and the kind of triangle that's created as these two lines of the water and the knife kind of meet at that 90-degree angle. So there's this kind of contrast with the circular eye, and we've got the drain. We also have, the shower head, which is also circular as well. So it's, there's a lot going on in this scene. I think the things that I take away in watching something like this scene is thinking about how the visual rhythm of my edit is like the beat of a song, and it helps set the pacing of the film, and it also helps anticipate what might be happening later on. So, oftentimes with my students, if you have a jump cut early on, I encourage people to actually start incorporating jump cuts throughout the piece and kind of make that an aesthetic choice, even if it started out as a mistake. Lean into it and kind of add to it and make it part of the aesthetic of the piece if you can't get away from that initial jump cut. And again, it depends on the severity of the jump cut and things like that. But again, when you look at the opening of the Psycho shower scene, there are some cuts that just don't need to happen, you know? But it helps give this kind of sense of like, yeah, this all seems normal. She's just taking a shower, but there's something a little off. It's a little bit of that like spidey sense going off. And then it really kind of ramps up and you can really see that kind of narrative arc of the scene purely just in the visual rhythm of that edit and how those cuts create intensity just by cutting. So that's another just kind of rule, is that the more edits you have, the more intense your visual rhythm. And is that right for your scene? Like, are you trying to get us to believe that these characters are falling in love? And do the quick edits help us in that kind of like euphoric, surreal, displaced, kind of feeling, out of body feeling when you're falling in love? Or is it just like too fast and it's distracting from me actually, or your audience, connecting with your characters falling in love? So you want to pay attention to how quick your edits are. Similarly, if you just have kind of the same rhythm throughout your edit, it's kind of like listening to the same song over and over and over again. It just kind of gets a little boring. So you might want to think about, how do I kind of ramp this up? Or if you're having a pacing issue where you're kind of like, oh God, things are dragging, try to find ways to maybe introduce more edits, because that might help pick things up a bit and kind of shake things up just by changing up the visual rhythm of the scene.